welcome to this session of the Environment Politics Online Seminar Series. This time we have two speakers and a very interesting, as always, a very interesting paper. And I welcome as our speakers Guilherme de Queiroz-Stein and Karen Siegel. And they will talk about addressing inequalities in biodiversity governance, access and benefit sharing under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Guilherme and Karen are both from the University of Münster. Perhaps they will say a few words about themselves in the beginning, but I just say Guilherme is a PhD candidate at the Institute of Political Science and works in the research group Transformation and Sustainability Governance in South American Bioeconomies. And this research group is led by Dr. Karen Siegel and examines to what extent and in which ways bioeconomy development promotes or hinders inclusive sustainability transitions in South America, looking at social biodiversity in Brazil, the forestry sector in Uruguay, and the agri-food sector in Argentina. So that's just the short bio both provided Karen will start, I think, and do some general background of the paper, and then Guilherme will go in depth of the research, and then we'll have a Q&A discussion. We have time, as always, until 5:30 CET, so 1.5 hours. And I don't know how long you prepare, typically 30 to 40 minutes input, and then the rest is reserved for discussion. And so without further ado, I hand to Karen and Guilherme.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction, Daniel. And yeah, nice to see you all. What we are presenting today is work in progress, and that's why we're especially happy to have the opportunity. And that also means that any comments, feedback, questions, anything that's not clear is more than welcome. Daniel has already given a bit of an introduction. I'm just seeing a message in the slide. Can everyone hear me okay? Maybe you can give me a sign. Yes, I see thumbs up. Okay, then I will just continue. Thank you. Okay, so at the start, I'll say a little bit more about the research group, although Daniel has already given an introduction. So we're funded by the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture and started in April 2020, which you may remember was during the first lockdown. So we had various team members spread out across different countries in Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil and South America, and then also between Germany and the UK, where I was based previously. Maybe I can just show briefly the team, because a couple of people are also in the room, in the Zoom room with us today. So I think Daniela and Luisa are also here. And the others are also working in a combination of virtual and in-person work. Okay, and with that, I'll start on the actual topic. So we are talking about biodiversity governance and especially the Convention on Biological Diversity. And a key concern in biodiversity governance is the question of how biodiversity is or should be used and how benefits that can come from using biodiversity are or should be distributed. For example, when particular plants are used for new pharmaceutical or cosmetic or food products. And there are several dimensions to this. So one is the international level or international dimension. And historically, countries in the global north have often exploited natural resources and biodiversity in areas with very high biodiversity, but in the global south. So a lot of tropical countries, but also other countries. And so then these industrial countries in the global north have developed a greater capacity to produce science and technology based on using these resources. And so at some point then countries in the global south responded and said, well, you know, the biodiversity is found in our countries, in our territories, and so we should have the sovereign rights over the biological and genetic resources. And also, if using these resources leads to economic or scientific benefits, then these should be fairly distributed at an international level. And with this approach, there's sort of, or with this question dimension are sort of two approaches or discourses, one arguing that biodiversity and associated resources belong to humankind, and then the other one saying, no, they come under national sovereignty. And maybe you already see how different interests are also reflected in these positions. So that's the international dimension, but there is also a dimension at the national level within countries. And this is also particularly important because often the communities living in areas of high biodiversity in certain countries often have a lot of knowledge about the resources in the areas where they live, often also have centuries of experience of using these, or also generating their own products and putting their own knowledge and science into that. But very often, these are also communities, often indigenous communities, but not only, who are also very much marginalized, both economically and politically in countries. So here we have another dimension within countries, where it's also important to make sure that those communities in a country that live in those areas and have the knowledge and have also used them for a long time also get a fair share of the benefits. And so the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, seeks to deal with such questions. And as we can see here, it was signed in 1992 at the UN Conference on Environment and Development, which was held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil at the time. And we can see on the map here, the coverage or the take-up was actually pretty good, but one sort of gap is standing out, and that's the US. That is quite noticeable. It came into force a year later, 93, as the main global instrument to combat the loss of biodiversity. And it provides a comprehensive framework of legally binding international standards which set out or define the rights and duties related to the management, conservation, and use of genetic resources and traditional knowledge associated. And for this, it set out this series of innovative rights, which are relevant for the distribution of benefits at both the international, but then also at the national level. So states have the sovereign right to exploit their own resources. But then it's also necessary to respect, preserve, and maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles which are relevant for the conservation and the sustainable use, so relating to what I said earlier. And then finally, to encourage the equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the use of such knowledge, innovations, and practices. So this was a bit the broader context, both of the research group, but then also of the topic. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Guilherme, who will talk more specifically about the question of access and benefit sharing in the academic literature and in our research design, and then also present some of our initial findings from the case of Brazil. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So our departing point here, the Convention on Biological Diversity assume three objectives: the conservation of the biodiversity, the sustainable uses of the genetic resource, and the benefit sharing, as Karen said. And actually, especially the benefit sharing is very innovative in the sense that there is no too much experience in the whole history of the humanity how to implement that. And since the sign of the Convention on Biological Diversity 40 years ago, there is a lot of discussion about how to implement that, what kind of mechanisms and what kind of regulatory approach, and same the definition of the main concepts that will guide this governance area. It's something quite disputed, quite controversial. There is no international benchmarking about how doing that. And actually, just less than half of the countries that signed the Convention on Biological Diversity implemented specific legislation on ABS, access and benefit sharing. Probably will use a lot this acronym in my presentation. And also there is important literature on ABS. The most part of this literature is discussing how to implement this kind of regulation, what are the contractual challenges, but usually it's more a legal discussion operating more on an abstract level. There is an absence of empirical studies to understand, okay, once you implement ABS regulation, what happened? What are the effects of this regulation in the real life and for different actors? And at the same time, so this is an important gap in the literature, this gap of studying the implementation of ABS regulation. And another important gap, it's about inclusiveness. Inclusiveness, as I discussed later, it's an important concept. Actually, there is a lot of legal text discussing that in the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol and other international treaties. Is important. It's very clear the importance of inclusiveness, but there is not too much discussion. I would say that the most part of the literature on ABS is discussing the regulatory options, but not inclusiveness. And I would say when you compare to other areas as climate change, for example, there is not too much discussion about inclusiveness at national level when we think about the governance of biodiversity. So think about these research gaps, these literature gaps. We propose this research question: how do the ABS regulatory approach and the level of political inclusiveness affect the uses of biological resource? And here we are focused on the scientific and business economic uses of biological resource and the sharing of the benefits generated by economic and scientific activities using this. And our research aims, first, is to develop a conceptual framework to analyze and compare systematically different ABS governance arrangements at national level. This is important. We are thinking here about national level, not local level. What are the impacts at the community level? We are thinking that on national level and taking into account these two dimensions, the regulatory approach and the level of inclusiveness. And trace the evolution of ABS governance in Brazil and the scientific and economic effects of that. And why Brazil? And the main methodological argument for selecting the Brazilian case, it's because we found variation here within the case. We had since 1994, when the CBD Brazil ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity, until now, we found at least three different regulatory approaches, and in the sense it's possible to compare more or less the effects in different periods of the Brazilian history of these different regulatory approach, and also difference in the level of inclusiveness in this in each period. The methods of the research, we did some more than 20 semi-structured interviews with actors from different sectors, from academia, state, the private sector, the civil society, and international organization. We attempt to collect the perceptions, informations, arguments from different sectors that are disputing this governance area. Also, we investigate a lot of documents, policy papers, the scientific literature about the governance of biodiversity in Brazil, but about the biodiversity, but also about the traditional knowledge holders in Brazil, like indigenous people, traditional communities. So we used a lot of documents, more than 150 documents in our research, and also quantitative data from public records that express the results active in terms of regulating the access to genetic resource and also the benefit sharing. So the number of access, the notifications of products developed based on the Brazilian genetic heritage, and this is important, the Brazilian law, they adopted this concept of genetic heritage that encompasses the genetic resource, a sample of plants, of animals, but also the genetic information of the country. Other quantitative data we use was the number of notifications stating benefit sharing, the number of contracts, and also the resources that are available in the National Fund for Benefit Sharing. So the first dimension of our analysis is the political inclusiveness, and we define this as the level of openness of the decision-making process to the participation of different stakeholders relevant to the ABS governance, especially non-state stakeholders. So here we can think about the private sector, the academia, civil society organization, but we assume that the most important is the participation of traditional knowledge holders that are indigenous people, traditional communities, and also peasants and family farmers, and greater the participation of these stakeholders, greater the inclusiveness, and this is related, especially because historically the exclusion of these actors, especially traditional knowledge holders, so it's a kind of indicator of the inclusiveness as much as they're participating the decision-making process. And the other dimension we decide to analyze is the level of state control over decision regarding access to genetic resource and associated traditional knowledge. So here the regulatory approach, you have some different types of regulatory approach that is related to more or less state control over the decision of accessing some genetic resource. And the three models we established, first is the total open access, when there is no restriction to carry out bioprospecting activities, scientific investigations, and no requirement for government authorization or to disclosure of the activities related to accessing genetic resource. Usually in the situations of total open access, there is no specific legislation over ABS or any kind of legislation. And if you need to establish a benefit sharing contract, probably what will regulate that will be the private law. The second regulatory approach is the most diffused in the world, especially when you look for the countries that adopt ABS legislation. You usually is this approach of prior authorization. It's the idea that you need a state permission for going ahead with bioprospecting activities of scientific research. And the another regulatory approach is open access under terms and condition. Here you have specific legislation on ABS, but you don't need a state permit for going ahead with bioprospecting activities. And this is I would say, a little bit innovative when you look for this governance arrangement. Here, the requirement is that the users of genetic heritage, they must disclosure their activities. They must state what they are doing, what kind of genetic resource they are using, what will be the results expected from the project, if there will be or not benefit sharing. But you don't need authorization for doing that as a general rule. And here we try to state different combinations of level of inclusiveness and the regulatory approach. Here in this part you have, I don't know if you can see, but closer to more state-centered regulation, and the other part more decentralized market regulation, where you find open access. The idea of open access under terms and conditions, it's an intermediary between these two extremes. And also it's possible to think theoretically about different levels of inclusiveness in this in this different regulatory approach, the different levels of non-state actors participating in the decision-making process. And we, based on that model, we trace the evolution of the Brazilian ABS governance in three important phases. First, from 1994 until 2000. Here, the main milestone is the ratification of the Convention on Biological Diversity in Brazil until 2000. When in this time we identify a situation closer to idea of open access. You don't have a specific regulation on ABS. You don't need any state permit for doing bioprospecting activities. And this changed in 2000 when the Brazilian state established some regulations and decided to adopt a regulatory approach based on prior authorizations. For going ahead with bioprospecting projects, you would need the authorization from the Brazilian state for doing that. And that was the situation until 2015. In 2015, in Brazil, there was a new law passed. It's called the biodiversity law, and this law established a new system for regulating the access and benefit sharing in the country based on open access under terms and conditions. And also here it's possible to see an increasing important aspect, the increase in the level of inclusiveness from 2000 to 2003. And here is because Brazil also have this interesting governance arrangement. The decisions over ABS are not taken by a specific public body, but it's a council. And in 2003, this council was opened for the participation of civil society representatives. And that was an important milestone in terms of increasing the inclusiveness in this period. So now I will discuss a little bit more deep each moment. And what we identify in the research, it's from this first moment from 1994 until 2000, when the regulatory approach was total open access, but also we identify low inclusiveness in this process. There was no specific legislation on ABS, and just some reference in the environmental law, in the Brazilian Constitution, and same the Convention on Biological Diversity, but you don't, the country didn't have a specific legislation over that. Also, there is no specific space for civil society participation, and the whole debate on establishing an ABS regulation that it was implemented in 2000 was very close. Actually, there is first regulation, specific regulation on ABS established in 2000, was act from the executive branch. In Brazil, they call this provisional measure, and there was no, it was not approved, for example, for the Brazilian parliament, and there was no participation of civil society in deciding that, and especially no participation from traditional knowledge holders. So it was a moment of very low inclusiveness. And in terms of uses of biological resource, first, it was not clear that having open access was better than any type of regulation in terms of for scientific environment in Brazil, or same for doing business related to biodiversity. And there was cases of biopiracy, include cases that became a national scandal, and for that motive, the Brazilian government decided to establish a regulation in 2000. After that, it was established in the Brazilian National Congress commission, parliamentary commission for investigating this case. It was quite complicated, but also for who the companies and research institutions, universities, scientists doing research on that. The open access, it was also it mean also an environment of legal uncertainty about what you are doing. If you are doing you are doing biopiracy or not, you would be accused of that or not. So the rules here were not clear, and that was a problem. And another important aspect here is that there is no record of benefit sharing contracts in this moment. So yeah, and actually when you compare this with the literature and other studies in situations of open access, this total open access, there is no records of benefit sharing contracts, not just in Brazil, but also internationally. What's something important, because introducing in specific legislation on ABS looks like something important for guaranteeing the benefit sharing contracts. And in the second phase of our study, from 2000 to 2015, the regulatory model here was based on prior authorization from the state for developing bioprospective activities. Also, it was important this innovative arrangement in Brazil of establishing a genetic heritage management council. That's the instance that take decision over that, and especially the opening of this council in the 2003 for the participation of the non-state actors, and especially from private sector and civil society, also scientists. But in that moment, and this was so this opening of the council for the participation of these actors it was important for different aspects. For they could participate in the meeting, express their interest, their opinions, but they didn't have the right to vote in the concept. The vote in that moment from 2000 to 2015 was exclusive for state actors from different. And the most part of the state representatives, the government representatives in the council in this period was from public research institutions. So yeah, it increased the opening of this concept for civil society participation, increased the level of inclusiveness, but not in an ideal level, I'd say. But this is a moment with some interesting results. I'd say first on benefit sharing. This is a moment where it started having contracts over benefit sharing, and this is quite important. The idea that introducing this specific regulation over ABS, it's an instrument for guaranteeing benefit sharing. But by the other side, it was there was some negative effects in terms of the uses of biological resources, especially for scientific and business purpose. There was an increase in the transaction costs because you need to ask a state permit for doing your bioprospecting activities. And for that, you need to formulate a project. Sometimes you need a lawyer representing you in face of the state. It took time, the authorization from the Genetic Heritage Management Council. Sometimes it could take like 3 years for having authorization for a project, and that was a problem, especially if you are developing, for example, a technology or a new product and you are facing international concurrence over that. And as the transaction costs were very high, what happened was a situation of non-compliance. The most part of scientists and business and companies using genetic resource in Brazil in that moment were in non-compliance with the law, and this brought a lot of legal uncertainty. They didn't know exactly if they would receive a fine or not, and they need to take a decision for being in compliance with this law. I need to delay my project for 3 years, so I decided to go ahead without that. There was a lot of misinformation also, and this created an environment that was that became a barrier for developing advancing this kind of use of biological resource. And especially in 2010, starting to increase the agenda on the economy of biodiversity in Brazil. There was an increase in the benefit sharing, but also an increase in the state control over these activities, and a lot of fines, and this create an environment pressuring for changing the legislation. Actually, before it was a provisional measure, and now the different stakeholders decide that it would be interesting to have a proper law over that, and a law approved by Brazilian Congress and Brazilian legislative branch. And in 2015, they approved what it's called until nowadays the new biodiversity law, adopting a very different regulatory approach. Based on open access under terms and conditions. And the first, I would say, the main characteristic of this new regulatory approach is the end of government permits for bioprospecting activities. As a general rule, you don't need anymore to present a project and wait for the approval of the National Council for going ahead with bioprospecting activities. You just can go ahead with your research, and depending on the type of the results you achieve, you need to declare in an online system what you did, and in the case if that you generate an economic result from that, if there will be or not benefit sharing. And that was quite important in terms of reducing the transaction costs. Obviously, the transactions costs are not zero here. There is some transaction cost, but when you compare to the system of prior authorization, you decrease these transaction costs. And also another important aspect was a reform on the Genetic Heritage Management Council, giving the right to vote in the decision-making for non-state actors. And here, the idea of non-state actors, the concept of non-state actors in the Brazilian law encompass the private sector, academia, and representatives of traditional knowledge and traditional knowledge holders. And 3 different segments: indigenous people, traditional communities, and family farmers or peasants. And that was quite important, the idea that they have the right to vote in terms of inclusiveness, at least in a formal aspect. And also the opening of others pays for their participating. The sectoral chamber of traditional knowledge holders is for a chamber for discussing specific topics related to when the access to the genetic resource are associated with traditional knowledge. And the National Benefit Sharing Fund Management Committee. The new regulation, the new law on biodiversity, established also as a mechanism for benefit sharing, a national fund for benefit sharing. And in the committee that manage this fund, there is a greater participation, important number of representatives from traditional knowledge holders. And here, for example, the private sector, almost there is no participation in this committee. And this is an important aspect in terms of inclusiveness. Here, it's the composition of the council. There is the most part of the council are representatives from the government, but the Brazilian law established some limits for that. There must be always a minimum of 40% of representatives of non-state actors, that's traditional knowledge holders, academia, and private sector, and a maximum of 60% of representatives from the government. And this is somehow important because there is variations in terms of the change government. Sometimes they merge a ministry or they split a ministry, and this is important for guaranteeing that. But also we identify also political dynamics that affect or hinder the inclusiveness, because in somehow there is these advancements at the formal level for the inclusiveness, opening the institutional arrangement for more participation. But at the same time, especially during the Bolsonaro government, you can see here in the end of the meetings of the concept decrease a lot. And if you, for sure that having meetings is not enough for talking about inclusiveness, because so we also identify in our research there was a lot of power asymmetries within the council. This is an important barrier for achieving inclusiveness. But if you don't even have the meetings of the council, this is a problem also. In this first chart, also is interesting to compare here. This first part, just in blue, is the government, how it was the council, the right to vote before, and with the new system 2015, the right to vote was there was a bigger participation of non-state actors here in green and yellow. And what are the outcomes of this new regulatory approach established in 2015? Increasing compliance. Nowadays, we can verify that the most part of scientists and companies in Brazil are stating in the online system what they are doing. They are recording that, including because the transaction costs for doing that decreased a lot. And another interesting aspect regarding the compliance is the settlement of more than 4,000 access did between 2000 and 2015 that were in non-compliance with the law. So there was a transition rule that who was in non-compliance before could regularize this situation. We identified the record of more than 12,000 products developed accessing genetic resource and information from Brazilian biodiversity, and also interviewing the actors. Many of them argued that the new system brought a lot of predictability in terms of what you need to do for being in compliance with the law, but also predictability in terms of the when you need to share the benefits. That was something not clear before, and the new system established very clear what are the modalities, when you need to share or not the benefits, who needs to share the benefits, and how much, at least in a percentage of the net income. So this is also important, especially for doing business, to have this kind of predictability and legal certainty, because the whole definition of concepts and situations, same, it's very clear in the Brazilian law. For example, the defines how much the state can fine, what are the situations, and all these create an environment of legal certainty that's quite important for developing business and scientific activities based on genetic resource. And in terms of benefit sharing, also there is some interesting results, but I would say that it's more contradictory, because we found in the public records that more than 60% of the products notify that they must share some type of benefits, but the actual implementation of that for different reasons are very low. And same, the National Fund for Benefit Sharing, it delay a lot, the implementation. Nowadays, it is implemented, there is resource there, but until now, only 43 companies share the benefits, and there is no projects executed. And when you look for non-monetary projects, the Brazilian law also established the possibility of non-monetary benefit sharing. Until last year, there was no implementation over that. I think now this year some projects advanced, but until last year when we collected the data, we didn't find. So some of the initial key finds of our research. First is that change in ABS regulatory approach affect economic and scientific use of biological resource and the level of benefits to be shared. And here, probably we didn't find evidence that a situation of open access, it's too much better to scientific and business than a regulation. By the contrary, there is legal uncertainty. But at the same time, a very strong regulation asking for state permits can be an important barrier for this area. So probably an intermediary regulatory approach based on open access under terms and conditions, it's more efficient in economic terms and same to promote, and probably to generate benefits and to share benefits. But the level of inclusiveness is also important, especially in terms of guaranteeing the fairness of the results activity. In this sense, the participation of traditional knowledge holders can put pressure, firstly, for implementing the law, implementing the projects, but also it's quite important in deciding the allocation of the resource and the modalities of benefit sharing that will be the most used in these systems. So basic is that actually the key findings, we are thinking a lot about this yet, and it would be great to discuss this more with you before going ahead with the publication. But okay, I'd like to thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Guilherme and Karen, for this extremely interesting insight into your research and the Brazilian case. I would like to draw this session to a close. I think it was extremely interesting. Thank you so much for the presentation and the inputs. It's also actually always very, very interesting to have practitioners in the room, in the virtual room, that are not coming from academia, but they actually bring insights and from the field into this discussion. So Gabriela, thank you so much also for being here. And yeah, look forward to. I'll have to quickly look up the schedule just to remind you of the next session in the new year on the 11th of January. Matthew Lockwood from SPRU, so from Sussex, will talk about what are the politics of industrial decarbonization. So stay tuned for that one. And until then, I wish you all a very nice annual break, or whatever you call it, a Christmas break, season break, and see you next year.